Welcome to Truth Watchers. I'm Heath Henning. Today we are going to dive into the topic of a suffering and sin atoning Messiah figure in ancient rabbinic literature. I think a lot of people will be surprised to find such expressions in rabbinic theology and messianism. By the way, I have read a lot of ancient Jewish literature. If people would be interested in me doing more videos interacting with this material, leave a comment below and I can do that. Some people may question, why would ancient Judaism have a theology of a suffering, sin atoning Messiah? My answer to that should be obvious. It's based on the Hebrew scriptures. The Bible frequently makes expressions of a man or men who are providing atonement in their death. This is something that often gets overlooked by both Jews and Christians because finding these certain expressions don't fit what people expect the Bible to. In ancient Judaism, this stuff was acknowledged and commented upon often, but modern Judaism generally avoids such topics because it sounds like Christian theology. Christians simply overlook these passages in the Old Testament because they expect only to find passages about Jesus Christ as an atonement. But let's look a little closer to what the Bible says to begin with. In Exodus 32, verses 30 through 32, after Israel makes the golden calf, Moses says he would ascend up Mount Sinai to God and make an atonement for their sins. When he arrives, Moses requests God would blot him out of the book. This presumably is a reference to the book of life, though it's not specifically stated as such. This is at least how ancient Jewish texts interpreted the passage. Once again, in Numbers 11:15, after the people complained and provoked the Lord to anger, Moses makes a similar plea to God to kill him. Christians reading this account assume Moses was requesting his life to end because he was vexed by the troubles the people were causing him during the wilderness wandering. However, ancient Jewish texts again referred to these events as Moses requesting his own death as an atonement for the sins of Israel. In Numbers 25, the Moabite women seduced the Israelite men, and we read the account of Phinehas killing a man of Israel and a woman of Moab with a javelin. This is said specifically in verse 13 to have made an atonement for the children of Israel. In the apocryphal text Ben Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, chapter 45, verse 23, it says Phinehas made reconciliation for Israel. In 2 Samuel 21, Israel is enduring a famine in the land because the sin of King Saul, who slaughtered the Gibeonites. King David asked in verse 3, wherewithal shall I make the atonement? With the answer returning to hand over 7 of Saul's descendants to be put to death. This appeased God's wrath and ended the famine that lasted 3 years. Again, after King David takes a census of the people, God judges his actions with a plague in 1 Chronicles 21. In verse 17, David requests punishment to be on him and not the people. He says, let thine hand, I pray thee, O Lord, my God, be on me and on my father's house, but not on thy people, that they should be plagued. One more example is Jonah, who running from God enters a ship of Tarshish and gets caught in a storm. Jonah offers himself to be thrown overboard to save the people in the ship from God's wrath in Jonah 1, verses 11 through 15. It is no surprise that Jesus Christ used the figure of Jonah as a prophecy of his own sacrificial death and resurrection in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we find the Jewish nation understood the idea of an individual dying for an atonement for the nation. Caiaphas, the high priest, says to the Sanhedrin in John 11:50, quote, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people and the whole nation perish not, unquote. In the following verse, John narrates that this comment of Caiaphas was a prophecy about Jesus Christ suffering for the people. The Apostle Paul follows Moses in wishing himself accursed to save the people of Israel in Romans 9, verse 3, saying, quote, for I could wish that myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh, unquote. Again, in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 11 through 12, Paul uses the analogy of Christ's death to explain his life was frequently delivered to death so that they can live. All these passages indicate the ancient Jewish concept that a man or men could die for an atonement for others. This, of course, is the backdrop of the multitude of passages that Jesus Christ's substitutionary death as an atonement for the sins of the world. Second Temple Jewish literature also provides a general understanding of the Jewish nation. In Second Maccabees 7, verses 37 through 38, one of the 7 brothers being martyred states that their death and suffering would occur so that God would give his mercy to the nation. Quote, "But I, as my brethren, offer up my body and life for the laws of our fathers, beseeching God that he would speedily be merciful unto our nation, and that thou by torments and plagues mayest confess that he alone is God, and that in me and my brethren the wrath of the Almighty, which is justly brought upon our nation, may cease." Unquote. In the 2nd century AD Jewish document, Second Baruch, chapter 13, 9 through 10, we find another example of God afflicting the Jews for their own forgiveness. Here, the Jewish nation is referred to as God's sons, and it states, quote, "Therefore, he did not spare his own sons first, but he afflicted them as his enemies because they sinned. Therefore, they were once punished that they might be forgiven." Unquote. In the Mishnah, which was composed around AD 200, we find a passage referring to Achan, who makes confession to Joshua about having taken spoils from Jericho and gets stoned to death. His death is said to atone for his sins, as are others who confess their sins. The passage states, quote, "If he knows how to make his confession, to say to him, say, may my death be an atonement for all my sins." Unquote. These are just a few examples of many that exist in ancient Jewish texts. Others can be found in the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, who offers himself and his family to die for the Jewish nation. Also in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and other ancient Jewish texts make similar expressions that can be found. I have on the screen, if you're watching this as a video, other passages that have similar expressions. I also have a number of these texts quoted in an article at truthwatchers.com titled Isaiah 53 in Ancient Judaism. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find the Qumran community has some interesting views concerning atonement. In one text, it states, quote, "Ceremonies of atonement cannot restore his innocence, neither cultic waters his purity. He cannot be sanctified by baptism in oceans and rivers, nor purified by mere ritual bathing." Unquote. I have this source cited on the screen for those watching, but this tells us rituals cannot atone for sin. By the way, the Jewish antecedent of baptism identified here proves there is no basis for baptismal regeneration. Another text indicates that the Qumran community believed, quote, "atoning for sin was made by working justice and suffering affliction," unquote. So here, suffering of a righteous person was part of receiving atonement. A few other texts indicate keeping the covenant was the primary way the Qumran community viewed themselves as atoning for the land. So this community thought their righteousness was efficacious for all of Israel. In other texts, repentance of sins will obtain atonement. Still, another text express atonement is also provided for all in the generation by an individual who suffers at the hands of his generation. One text applied this to Moses, stating, quote, "Indeed, Moses had atoned for their sin," unquote. As I mentioned earlier, this is how the ancient Jews understood Moses' request to die for the nation. Commenting on Habakkuk 2:4, a commentary found in the Dead Sea Scrolls says, quote, "This refers to all those who obey the law among the Jews, whom God will rescue from the place of judgment because of their suffering and their loyalty to the teacher of righteousness." It is believed that the teacher of righteousness is the individual who founded the Qumran community. He may have been perceived as a messianic figure, though this is debated among scholars. It is believed that he suffered at the hands of the mainstream Jewish leaders who persecuted and killed him. So he may have been viewed as having died an atoning death according to the Qumran theology. So these views clearly predate Christianity and prevailed all throughout Jewish thought of various sects of Judaism prior to and after the first century. These views are also present in later rabbinic writing, which you would expect the Jews to avoid these ideas after Christianity arose. In the classic book, Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, Alfred Edersheim wrote, quote, "But still, as the rabbinic ideas were at least based on the Old Testament, a careful perusal of their scriptural quotations shows such doctrines as the pre-mundane existence of the Messiah, his elevation above Moses, and even above the angels, his representative character, his cruel suffering and derision, his violent death, and that for his people, his works on behalf of the living and of the dead, his redemption and the restoration of Israel, the opposition of the Gentiles, their partial judgment and conversion, the prevalence of his law, the universal blessings of the later days, and his kingdom. All can be clearly deduced from unquestioned passages in ancient rabbinic writings," unquote. There is a unique twist in rabbinic messianism that needs to be explained, however. A modern Jewish scholar, Jacob Emanuel Choquette, states in his book Mashiach, the principle of the Mashiach and the Messianic era in Jewish law and tradition, page 93, quote, "Jewish tradition speaks of two redeemers, each one called Mashiach. Both are involved in ushering in the Messianic era. They are Mashiach ben David and Mashiach ben Yosef," unquote. This doctrine of two messiahs appears in multitudes of rabbinic texts. Just to cite one, this is the Midrash on the Psalms, commenting on Psalm chapter 60, verse 30. Quote, "God said, I am he who wrought a miracle for Jephthah the Gileadite, and I am also he who wrought a miracle for Gideon, the son of the tribe of Manasseh. His deliverance was deliverance for only an hour, but in the everlasting time to come, I shall deliver you through the Messiah, the son of Ephraim, and through the Messiah, the son of David, of the tribe of Judah. Ephraim also is the strength of my beginning. The Messiah, the son of Ephraim, will be the first to take upon himself the yoke of kingship, but Judah is my scepter. That is, the Messiah, the son of David, will finally rule." In ancient rabbinic theology, there was the Messiah who descended from King David and a Messiah who descended from Joseph's son, Ephraim. So this Messiah figure would be called interchangeably the Messiah ben Joseph or Messiah ben Ephraim. By the way, the ben means son of, or in case it could imply the descendant of. David Mitchell has a book on the topic of the Messiah figure titled Messiah ben Joseph. And on page 229 through 230, he writes, quote, "In the Midrashim, the narrative of Messiah ben Joseph always includes a programmatic element. He appears in Galilee, gathers a band of followers, establishes a kingdom, dies in Jerusalem, and is later raised. Yet, while this programmatic element steps to the fore in these midrashim, similar sequences of events can be pieced together from much earlier texts. It may be questioned, where is this idea of a Messiah coming from Galilee? Quoting from an early Jewish midrash titled Agadah HaMessiah, quote, "Rabbi Huna repeated in the name of Rabbi Levi. This verse teaches that Israel will assemble in Upper Galilee, and there within Galilee, the Messiah of the lineage of Joseph will be revealed to them," unquote. Now, you may remember in the Gospel of John, when the people argued whether Jesus was the Christ, in John 7, verse 41, quote, "Others said, this is the Christ, but some said, shall Christ come out of Galilee?" unquote. And in verse 52, the Pharisees responded, quote, "They answered and said unto him, Art thou also of Galilee? Search and look, for out of Galilee arises no prophet," unquote. However, the Pharisees were wrong, as a certain prophet Jonah, who Jesus used as a sign of his own resurrection, was from Gath Hepher, a city in Galilee, according to 2 Kings 14:25. We also find in the historical records of Josephus many messianic pretenders arose out of Galilee in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. The interesting thing about these messianic pretenders is that many of them emulated the prophet Joshua, who descended from Joseph out of the tribe of Ephraim. In Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, book 17, verses 271 through 272, as well as in War of the Jews, Book 2, verse 56, Josephus mentions a Judas, son of Ezekias, from Sepphoris, Galilee, in the days of Herod. In Antiquities, Book 17, verse 273 through 277, there is a Simon, a slave of Herod, who declared himself king and burned the royal palace of Jericho. In Antiquities, Book 7, verse 278 through 284, a man named Ethronges, a shepherd, set himself as king. Menahem, in War of the Jews, Book 2, verse 433 through 440, called the Galilean, set himself, quote, a king to Jerusalem, unquote. Judea was full of robbers intending to be set up as kings, according to Antiquity of the Jews, Book 17, verse 285. Thaddeus, in Antiquities, Book 20, verse 97, is described as a magician who claimed he would cause the Jordan River to divide like Joshua did. Similarly, Messiah ben Ephraim is said to be able to cause, quote, seas and rivers to stop flowing, unquote, in Pesikta Rabbati 36, verse 1. One who came out of Egypt in Acts 21:38, also mentioned by Josephus in Antiquities, Book 20, verses 169 through 170, claimed to do miracles and that he would cause the walls of Jerusalem to fall as Joshua did to Jericho. Notice that these rebels claimed to be king, but were from Galilee or emulated Joshua, who descended from the tribe of Ephraim. This indicates the popular idea of the first century accepted the Messiah from Galilee, who was descended from Ephraim. Now, I just mentioned a rabbinic text titled Pesikta Rabbati. Andreas Kish, referring to this text, wrote in a paper titled Christ in the Midrash, True Messiah Ephraim, stated, quote, a collection of Jewish homilies for Sabbath titled Pesikta Rabbati, recorded in the 7th century, but probably going back to earlier times, presumably to the 4th century. 4 of his texts, section 34 to 37, which might be the earliest chapters, probably originating even from the 2nd century, contain apocalyptic visions featuring a certain Messiah Ephraim, son of Joseph, whose description contains a surprisingly large number of Christological features, as if they were copy-pasted from the New Testament, unquote. I'm going to read a relevant passage from this rabbinic text. For those watching the video, you'll see that the text will have certain scriptures, verses in parentheses and others in brackets. Those in the parentheses are added from the Jewish translator, while those in brackets are my own additions, because it seems the Jewish translator didn't want to include these certain references since they were too Christian in implication. The following is a lengthy quote from Pesikta Rabbati, chapter 36 and 37, found in William Broad's translation, volume 2, pages 677 through 686. Quote, it is the light of the Messiah, of which it is said, and God saw the light, and it was good. Genesis 1:4. This verse proves the Holy One, blessed be He, contemplated the Messiah and His works before the world was created, then, under His throne of glory, put away His Messiah until the time of the generation in which He will appear. Now, notice this implies the pre-existing Messiah who is called the Light, similar to Jesus Christ in the book of John. The quote continues, Satan asked the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, for whom is the light which is put away under thy throne of glory? God replied, for him who will turn thee back and put thee to utter shame. Satan said, Master of the universe, show him to me. God replied, come and see him. And when he saw him, Satan was shaken, and he fell upon his face and said, surely this is the Messiah who will cause me and all the counterparts in heaven of the princes of the earth's nations to be swallowed up in Gehenna, citing Isaiah 25, verse 8. Satan asked, what is his name? What kind of being is he? The Holy One, blessed be He, will reply, he is the Messiah, and his name is Ephraim, my true Messiah. At the time of the Messiah's creation, the Holy One, blessed be he, will tell him in detail what will befall him. There are souls that have been put away with thee under my throne, and it is their sins which will bend thee down under a yoke of iron and make thee like a calf whose eyes grow dim with suffering, and will choke thy spirit as with a yoke. Because of the sins of these souls, thy tongue will cleave to the roof of thy mouth. That's a reference to Psalms 22:15. Art thou willing to endure such things? The Messiah will ask the Holy One, blessed be he, will my suffering last many years? The Holy One, blessed be he, will reply, it is a period of 7 years, which I have decreed for thee. But if thy soul is sad at the prospect of thy suffering, I shall at this moment banish these sinful souls. The Messiah will say, Master of the universe, with joy in my soul and gladness in my heart, I take this suffering upon myself, provided that not one person in Israel perish, that not only those who are alive be saved in my days, but that also those who are dead, who died from the days of Adam up to the time of redemption. Note here, there is a difference of this Messiah's suffering will be efficacious for every generation, not just the one generation that lived in the generation as we saw in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is likely due to the doctrine of the Messiah's pre-existence. Now, notice also in this next portion of the passage I'm quoting, there is a conflating of Messiah ben Ephraim and Messiah ben David. In fact, they're calling him Messiah Ephraim, but it's also calling him Messiah ben David, son of David. Quote, during the 7-year period preceding the coming of the son of David, iron beams will be brought and loaded upon his neck until the Messiah's body is bent low. Then he will cry and weep, and his voice will rise up to the very height of heaven. And he will say to God, Master of the universe, how much can my strength endure? How much can my spirit endure? How much my breath before it ceases? How much can my limbs suffer? This is possibly an allusion to Psalms 22:14. All my bones are out of joint. Or Psalms 22:16. They pierced my hands and my feet. The text continues, am not I flesh and blood? It was because of the ordeal of the son of David that David wept, saying, my strength is dried up like a potsherd. Psalm 22:16. During the ordeal, the son of David, the Holy One, blessed be he, will say to him, Ephraim, my true Messiah, long ago, ever since the 6 days of creation, thou didst take this ordeal upon thyself. At this moment, thy pain is like my pain. Note here that the pre-existence of the Messiah, who is called Ephraim, but also identified as the son of David. Furthermore, God says the Messiah's pain is like his own, depicting a unity of God and the Messiah. The text continues, at these words, the Messiah will reply, now I am reconciled. The servant is content to be like his master. It is taught, moreover, that in the month of Nisan, the patriarchs will arise and say to the Messiah, Ephraim, our true Messiah, even though we are thy forebearers, thou art greater than we, because thou didst suffer for the iniquities of our children. Note this expression shows the Messiah is greater than the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The text continues saying, and terrible ordeals befell thee, such ordeals as did not befall earlier generations or later ones. For the sake of Israel, thou didst become a laughing stock and a derision among the nations of the earth, and didst sit in darkness, in thick darkness, and thy eyes saw no light, and thy skin cleaved to thy bones. A reference to Psalms 22:17. And thy body was as a dry piece of wood, and thine eyes grew dim from fasting, and thy strength was dried up like a potsherd. Psalms 22:15. All these afflictions on account of the iniquities of our children. That could be referencing Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 6, verse 8, 10 through 11. All these because of thy desire to have our children benefit by that goodness which the Holy One, blessed be he, will bestow in abundance upon Israel. Yet it may be because of the anguish which thou didst greatly suffer on their account. For thine enemies put thee in prison, Isaiah 53:8, that thou art displeased with them. The patriarchs will say to him, Ephraim, our true Messiah, be content with what thou hast done, for thou made content the mind of thy Maker, and our minds also. Then so taught Rabbi Simeon ben Pazi, the Holy One, blessed be he, will lift the Messiah up to the heaven of heavens, and will cloak him in something of the splendor of his own glory as protection against the nations of the earth. Again, here we see the unity or equality with God as the Messiah is dressed in God's own glory. The text continues, particularly against the wicked Persians. He will be told, Ephraim, our true Messiah, be thou judge of these, and do with them what thy soul desires. For the nations would long since have destroyed thee in the instant, had not God's mercy been exceedingly mighty in thy behalf. As is said, Ephraim is a darling son unto me. Jeremiah 31, verse 20, unquote. Now, this quote continues to cite verses such as Psalms 22, verse 8, verses 14 through 15, verses 16, in reference to the Messiah's suffering. It also cites Psalms 104, verse 1, Isaiah 11, verse 4, Isaiah 59, verse 17, 61, verse 10, 63, verse 2, and Daniel 7, verse 9, in reference to the Messiah's victory as king over the earth. These two streams of prophecy conflate Messiah ben Ephraim and Messiah ben David as one messianic figure. It is notable that I include a number of references from Isaiah 53 and more so from Psalms 22. Rivka Ulmer, in a paper titled Psalm 22 in Pesikta Rabbati, The Suffering of the Jewish Messiah and Jesus, writes, quote, in rabbinic literature, Psalm 22 is also cited as relating to the affliction of the Jewish Messiah, unquote. This is something we would not expect considering how ancient Judaism bucked against the idea of Jesus Christ being the suffering and dying Messiah of early Christians, and early Christians used Isaiah 53 and particularly Psalms 22 to provide scriptural support that Jesus was the Messiah. The New Testament reference of Psalm 22 is found frequently as having fulfilled prophecies in Jesus Christ's crucifixion, including Matthew 15:24, Matthew 27:39 through 40, and verse 45 and 46, Mark 15, verse 24, verse 33, and 15, verse 34, John 19, verse 24 and 28, and John chapter 20, verse 25 through 27. Other early Christians quoted Psalm 22 as a messianic prophecy, such as Clement of Rome in 1 Clement chapter 16, and Justin Martyr in his first apology of Justin, chapter 35 and 38, as well as the dialogue with Trypho in chapter 103. We would expect ancient Jewish texts to avoid any messianic claims to Psalm 22. However, this understanding of Psalms 22 as a messianic prophecy may be a deep-rooted tradition in Judaism, which would explain why the early rabbis refused to reject it as a messianic prophet. The Dead Sea Scrolls may have alluded to Joseph's suffering in Psalm 22. One text states, quote, worse, Joseph had been given into the power of foreigners who drained his strength and shattered all his bones until he was about to perish. At that point, he cried out, calling upon the mighty God to save him from their power. He said, O Father, my God, leave me not forsaken in the power of the nations. Render me justice that the poor and oppressed should not perish. Unquote. In this text, Joseph cries, O Father, my God, leave me not forsaken, likely alludes to Psalm 22:1, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? The first sentence of this passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls says Joseph had been given to the powers of foreigners who drained his strength and shattered all his bones, which is likely alluding to Psalm 22, verses 14 through 15, which states, I am poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint, my strength is dried up like potsherd. Another prophecy in Psalm 22 is in verse 16, which says, for dogs have compassed me, and the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, identifying Gentiles surrounding this suffering figure. Likewise, in this text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the two phrases appear as the powers of foreigners and again the power of the nations. David Mitchell says in his book Messiah ben Joseph, page 99, concerning this text, it, quote, may be the earliest surviving post-biblical text to feature a suffering Josephite Mashiach, unquote. By the term post-biblical, he is identifying post-Hebrew scriptures or after the Old Testament. There are multitudes of ancient rabbinic texts that reveal unambiguous references to a dying Messiah figure. These references range from as early as the 6th century BC, the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 26, which states the Messiah should be cut off, and onto the 12th century Targum of Zechariah, which expands the expression of Zechariah chapter 12, verses 10 through 12, to elaborate Messiah ben Ephraim being killed at the hands of Gog outside of Jerusalem. On the screen, I have listed 16 different Jewish texts, which I have personally been acquainted with. It is very probable there are much more that I don't know about. On this following slide, I have listed various rabbinic texts that have a Messiah being resurrected. On the left-hand side, I have listed texts that refer to the Messiah specifically as being the first to be resurrected. This is in unison of the New Testament, which refers to Jesus Christ as the first to rise from the dead. For example, Acts 26, verse 23 says, quote, that Christ should suffer and that he should be the first that should rise from the dead, unquote. Similar comments are made in 1 Corinthians 15:20, Colossians 1:18, Revelations 1:5. On the right-hand side of the current slide on the screen, I listed the texts that I have seen that present the Messiah being resurrected during the general resurrection. The Messiah's resurrection presupposes the Messiah died in order to be raised again, but also these provide an interesting correlation with the New Testament about Christ being resurrected. Another interesting parallel of the New Testament Christology in rabbinic literature is the fact that the Messiah is supposed to disappear and return again. Quoting the Midrash on the book of Ruth, known as Ruth Rabbah, which is commenting on Ruth chapter 2, verse 14, it states, quote, the fifth interpretation makes it refer to the Messiah. Come hither, approach to royal state, and eat of the bread refers to the bread of royalty. And dip thy morsel in the vinegar refers to his suffering, as it is said, but he was wounded because of our transgressions, Isaiah 53, verse 5. Rabbi Berechiah said in the name of Rabbi Levi, the future Redeemer will be like the former Redeemer, referring to Moses. Just as the former Redeemer revealed himself and later was hidden from them. And how long was he hidden? 3 months, as it is said, and they met Moses and Aaron, Exodus 5:20. So the future Redeemer will be revealed to them and then be hidden from them, unquote. This passage reveals the Messiah is royal, is to suffer for the transgressions of others, with a quote from Isaiah 53, and as the Redeemer, he would disappear and return again. Other rabbinic texts such as Pesikta di Rab Kahanan 5:8 and Pesikta Rabbati 15:10 include this thought of a disappearing and second coming of the Messiah. Of course, the New Testament, we learn that Jesus Christ has appeared, suffered for our sins, was resurrected, ascended to heaven, and we currently await for his return. And these are mentioned in Matthew 24, verse 3 and verse 30, John 14, 1 through 4, Acts 1, verses 9 through 11, 1 Peter 1:7, and 1 Peter 4:13, and Revelations 1:7, just to cite a few such references. This is actually just a small sample of many references throughout ancient Jewish literature that parallels Christian ideas. I think this information would be beneficial to share with Jews today, since most modern Jews are unacquainted with their own ancient texts. Most rabbis are clueless of these facts, just as most Christians are clueless of the writings of the early church fathers. The point I'm making here is that Christianity is not just substantiated in the Old Testament, but even in rabbinic literature, we find their views of the Hebrew scriptures conforms to Christianity, which we would expect rabbis to avoid these views as Judaism became antagonistic towards Christianity very quickly in history. Mitch Glasser concluded in his book Isaiah 53 Explained, on page 121 saying, "The choices regarding the coming of the Messiah are simple. We could believe in one Messiah who will come as king. This is a traditional Jewish view, yet it ignores the prophecies of a suffering Messiah. We could believe in two Messiahs, one to die and the other to reign as king, Messiah the son of Joseph and Messiah the son of David, a minority opinion within traditional Judaism. The third view is that held by Messianic Jews and believing Christians, that there is one Messiah, but the prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures point to two distinct roles, dying for the sins and reigning as king in the Messianic era. We believe that Yeshua, the Messiah, came the first time to die for our sins as a humble servant and rose from the dead as predicted by Isaiah and confirmed by the gospel writers, and he will return a second time to reign as king." Unquote. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning into Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com, because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as it is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.